This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain. MIP.
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson. Make It Plain. Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have followed Make It Plain over the years, we've always tried to do something special and extraordinary during African American History Month, Black History Month. And over the years, we've had a number of the iconic African scholars who are now ancestors join us, from Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan to Dr. Sharsha McIntyre to Dr. John Henry Clark to Dr. Leonard Jeffries to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing to Dr. Renoko Rashidi, who was with us more recently. All of these great icons have transitioned to the ancestral realm. This year, someone who really we owe a great deal of gratitude for introducing many in the larger sphere and the larger community to these icons. Years ago, he began to organize programs and lectures where these icons could be seen and heard by the masses. And he has, in fact, now inherited the mantle from some of these great scholars, not only in terms of his research and writing, but in terms of the tours he's provided, whether they be here in this country, particularly in Washington, D.C., or in Kemet in Egypt itself. So I thought we would spend this month with him. As I alluded to, he is an author and a publisher, a cultural historian, an artist, and an educational consultant. He's a graduate of Howard University and has lectured extensively throughout the United States and 5 continents. He's the founder and director of IKG Cultural Resources and has devoted 43 years researching ancient Egyptian history, science, philosophy, and culture. He's traveled to Egypt 64 times since 1980 and is currently director of the Asa Restoration Project, which is funding the excavation and restoration of 3 25th dynasty tombs of Kushite noblemen on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. He is the first African American to fund and coordinate an archaeological dig in Egypt and has led more than 30 archaeological missions to Egypt since 2009. He's co-authored and co-authored 14 publications, which are currently used in classrooms around the world, and has 3 decades of study that have led him to the conclusion that ancient Africans were the architects of civilization and developed the rudiments of what has become the scientific, religious, and philosophical backbone of mankind. It is from this framework that IKG has concentrated its research and disseminated its findings. And so we are honored to have with us for what I know will be a fruitful and enlightening and blessed discussion through this month, our dear brother, Anthony Browder. Hey, man.
Thank you so much, brother, for that wonderful introduction and also for allowing me to be on the program this month.
Long overdue. And I don't know, now that we sit here, as I mentioned, all the ancestors of transition who were once elders, I don't know if that makes us elders now.
Well, I claim my eldership, brother. I turned 70 last year, so I'm claiming it.
Which I don't believe. Those of you seeing this on video, Tony does not look older than me at all. But brother, you've clearly been blessed by the ancestors and the elders and the work you're doing, and I'm thankful for you, man. And it's great to see you, and you look well.
Thank you, brother.
I want to give audience an opportunity, one, to learn a bit about the work you've been doing, and also learn a bit about our history, because I know you and I have always agreed, and that's been part of the struggle, hasn't it, Tony, that to understand that our history did not begin with slavery.
One of Dr. Clark's favorite sayings was that if you begin your history in slavery, everything since then looks like progress.
Yeah.
So my first trip to Egypt was with Dr. Ben in 1980. And after taking that trip, I was amazed to discover all of the knowledge carved on temples, tombs, that is over 5,000 years old, that clearly illustrates the legacy, historical and cultural legacy of African people. And I was never taught that information. It wasn't until 1977, brother, I graduated from Howard in 74. In 1977, February 21st, 1977, I went to hear Ivan Van Sertima speak at Georgetown Law School. He had just published They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America. He wowed me with his presentation of the Olmecs who came to Mexico and brought architecture, religion, and technology to the indigenous people there. But then he ended that presentation by saying that these Africans were from Egypt and the Egyptians were Black. That was the first time in my life. February 21st, 1977 was the first time in my life anyone ever told me that the ancient Egyptians were Black. I was blown away.
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, Tony, help us understand even the timing of that revelation. How widespread was that conversation, even in the academic circles, as early as 1977?
Well, we have to realize that the field of Egyptology was essentially started by white men who were brilliant scholars, but they were also racist. Flanders Petrie, George Reisner, and James Henry Breasted. Breasted was at the University of Chicago, founded the Oriental Institute. Reisner was at Harvard, and Petrie was based in London. These men, as brilliant as they were also a product of their time, and they believed in the inherent inferiority of Black people, of African people. And so they could look at these images on the tombs, they could look at the face of Haramaka, the Sphinx, and because of cognitive dissonance, they could not accept the African images that were staring them in the face, and so they lied. They covered up the truth. And one of the things that Brother Lynn Jeffries shared with me back in the 80s when I first met him, he said that whoever controls the history of Egypt stands at the head of the human family. And so these racists had to falsify the truth and take Egypt out of Africa and separate African people from their own history and culture and feed the world lies about the mothers and fathers of culture and civilization. So when I first became aware of this falsification of African history, I wanted to know more. And that's what led me to seek out the works of Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, John Jackson, and others. And then once I went to Egypt with Dr. Ben and saw with my own eyes information that had intentionally been withheld from me throughout elementary school, high school, and college, I knew that I had to take on the responsibility of sharing this new knowledge with every Black life that mattered to me.
More MIP after this message. But those in Egyptology kind of took their cue, didn't they, from the Greeks who first went to Egypt and stole everything in the first place, right?
Well, let me kind of correct that myth.
Okay.
Because the Greeks came to Egypt as students to study at the feet of Africans. So if you look at the first Greeks who came into Egypt, Pythagoras, they came to study African knowledge, and they went home acknowledging what they had found in Egypt. So when Alexander comes to Egypt in 332 BC and conquers Egypt, Alexander, standing in the shadow of African greatness, rejected his father, Philip of Macedonia, and claimed that he was the son of Amun. And when he died, he was buried in Africa. So after Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy gained control of the territory that we now call Egypt, because originally the original name of Egypt was Kemet, an African word which means the nation of the Black people. Egypt is a Greek word which describes one temple in the northern part of the country. And so what Ptolemy did was to follow in the footsteps of other African rulers. They married African women so that the children who were born from that union would be viewed as the legitimate heirs to the throne, and they claimed themselves to be an extension or a continuation of the ancient Kemetic legacy. They marshaled their forces in Alexandria, the city in the northern part of Egypt, right on the Mediterranean, and they then created the first open education policy and opened the doors to Greeks to come to Egypt and study 3,000 years of Egyptian mathematics, engineering, astronomy, architecture, science, and philosophy. So they freely, the Greeks freely acknowledged that Egypt was the source of their knowledge. It was only later when racists came on the scene and began to classify people by color that they had to lift up Greece at the expense of Egypt. So that's where, you know, these falsehoods come in, and that is the essence of the stolen legacy, which George G. and James wrote about.
And so in terms of those coming in and lifting up one culture over the other, you mentioned Alexander, 332 BC. One of the things that Tony does, folks, and I have, my son has one, others have seen it, some of you may have seen it on video. He pulls out a timeline, and it stretches, I don't know how many feet.
Well, the large timeline is 19 feet. The small one is 9 feet.
But let's do the years. 332 BC. How many years of Kemetic history prior to that are we talking about?
Okay. The first recorded date in history is 4,230 BC. That date was recorded in Kemet. That represents the first use of a calendar of 365 and a quarter days. 4,230 BC. And BC in this instance, brother, means before Caucasians, right? So, if we study Greek history and Roman history, looking at the timeline, we know that Homer, the first European writer of note, did not write the Iliad and the Odyssey until about 834 BC. And Romulus and Remus, the mythological founders of Rome, did not create that nation state until about 730 BC. So Greece and Rome becomes the foundation of European culture and civilization. It's rooted in Greco-Roman history and culture. So in order to perpetuate this myth of white superiority, they had to erase all of the history that preceded it and say that philosophy and science and medicine began with the Greeks. That's why the Greeks are sitting on top of the pedestal. But if you go to Greece and look at the greatness of Greek architecture, say the Parthenon, for example, the Parthenon pales in comparison to the smallest temple in Egypt. There's no comparison whatsoever. So we have to use a timeline in order to put history in its proper context so that we know where Africans fit in and where Europeans come in. Dr. Clark often said that over half of human history was over before the first European wrote a book or lived in a house with a window. And that's a fact. It's a historical fact.
Anthony Browder, folks, is our special guest this month during African American History Month, and he's going to be with us every day. And so we're kicking off this first day. I do want to say this before we leave today. When I have it, here it is in front of me. If you want more information, we invite you to go to IKG-info.com or asarestorationproject.com, asarestorationproject.com. And during the course of the month, we're going to be talking about the Restoration Project, which is fascinating. Put 2025 on the calendar. And also a number of other things that our brother has been working on and been involved in. And so African American History Month, folks, is underway with Anthony Browder. Keep it locked in. Tell everyone about this. Tell them to subscribe to make it plain so we can hear more of our history. We thank you for joining us, Ismail Tony.
My pleasure, brother. Anytime.
More MIP after this message. Ladies and gentlemen, honored to have on Make It Plain a member of Congress with a brand new book out. We all know him, Representative Ro Khanna. His book, Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Representative, welcome to the show and congratulations on the book.
Reverend, thank you. It's really an honor to be on. I'm a fan of the show and your voice and appreciate being on with your listeners.
Well, thank you. And I'm a fan of yours as well and all the great progressive work that you're doing. First of all, on the book, talk to us about the inspiration for the book and the timing. We still have a great deal and a wide digital divide in America, don't we?
Reverend, we do. And my district, there's $11 trillion of market cap. Apple, Google, Intel, Yahoo went up 40% during the pandemic. And yet a lot of Americans are totally left out of the engine of modern wealth generation. You don't have opportunities in rural America. You don't have the same opportunities in Black America, in Latino communities. One of the theses of the book is you can't overcome the racial wealth gap without overcoming the racial wealth generation gap. You can't have things like Clubhouse popularized by the African American community, but no one is there actually when it comes to the venture capital or on the board or making the profits. And so the book is really saying, how do we get the opportunities of the modern economy to places and people who've been totally left out of it?
I know you have, if I'm not mistaken, advocated for regulation in this new economy and in Silicon Valley. Is that one of the ways we can get there and try to close that gap?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that we need regulation when it comes to some of the hate speech that's incited violence. I mean, people say, oh, First Amendment, but for everyone to have a First Amendment right to speak, we have to make these forums places that are welcoming of people, and you can't have violent hate speech that makes the places unwelcoming. But more than the regulations on data privacy, on speech, I think we have to be intentional about encouraging the investments and partnerships with land grant universities, with HBCUs, incentivizing the capital. I mean, $120 billion of venture capital, and guess how much goes to Black or Latino women of color every year? It's less than 0.3%. I mean, these are embarrassing statistics. I did an op-ed with the great John Lewis, one of the great honors, and he said, "Bro, technology rights are the new civil rights." And I don't think people fully grasp, with 25 million digital jobs in the engine of modern wealth generation, how problematic it is that huge segments of our country are excluded from these opportunities.
And you mentioned the jobs, even in the jobs, right? I mean, it's not easy for people of color to find jobs in Silicon Valley, is it?
It's not. And it's often, we had a situation, Zoom did a partnership with Claflin, which is one of the really well-known HBCUs. And at first, I mean, I had other companies and it was embarrassing. Claflin's dean kept sending me 4.0 resumes to that company and they kept getting rejected, not Zoom, other companies. And so there's a cultural issue in terms of recruiting and in terms of people having the cultural knowledge on how to do a whiteboard interview and all of the questions that get asked. Then there is a network issue. You graduate out of Stanford. I had, because I got the chance to teach there, I had students who had funding before they were even out of Stanford because they had these networks. Well, that's not the case for most people. And then even if you get one of these jobs, then you're often the only person of color on your team. You don't necessarily rise up. And so the recruitment is not just the challenge, it's the retention. And finally, are you part of the stock options? Are you part of the wealth generation? So there is a huge levels of exclusion. And one of the important things to recognize is it's not a lack of interest or lack of talent. One of the studies I cite shows that actually African-American young people have more interest, more interest in computer science than people in other races. This is actually documented. And yet something happens that does not allow us to take advantage of their talent and passion, and it's wrong.
Yeah, and you're right about the culture. That statistic you just shared, most don't know that, including many African Americans, because what's presented is there are only certain cultures now that are predisposed to wanting to be in the tech world. And even our self-perception is that there is not an interest, and definitely a perception that there's not excellence in education in that regard. When, as we know, a lot of kids are out here studying that and trying to get into that field. Beyond the regulation, though, I mean, that's not the only thing. What else can be done to change this atmosphere?
I think the boards need to be diversified, first of all, because if you don't have accountability at the top of people who are women, people of color, people from rural communities, you're not going to have a change in attitude. Second, the federal government is a big purchaser of IT service, billions and billions of dollars. If you were to have an incentive to say, look, 10% of your workforce needs to be in a rural community, 10% of your workforce needs to be diverse, you would suddenly incentivize these companies to find the talent. And let me tell you, the talent is there. There are a lot of places that have the talent. They need the opportunity, and the opportunity is not going to happen if we don't create the proper economic incentives. And by the way, with COVID, we realized not everything has to be in Silicon Valley. You can be working remotely and have these opportunities. The third is that there has to be a partnership with the private sector in these courses. So one of the big misconceptions is, you got to go become a coder, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of software engineering skills. Yeah, that's for some jobs, but not for a lot of jobs. A lot of these jobs, it requires a 10-month course, but it's got to be the right type of course. And it's got to be in partnership with some of these companies that know what they need for understanding the interviews, that know what it means to get an actual job. So you don't just have people taking these training courses and then not getting employed. I think all of those things will go some way. Rodney Sampson, who is Opportunity Hub, is really thoughtful about this, and he talks about having a goal 2025, 1 million African Americans in the digital space, especially with 25 million digital jobs. It's not a lot to say there should be 1 million. We're far off from that, but if we actually had a concerted effort, that's achievable.
And that is where the economy is going, where the technology is going. So people have to really, there's got to be an effort at bringing people along. We also look in the school system. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you too have advocated that every student in America, and we see this now more than ever after the pandemic, should have a laptop. I mean, when kids were home during COVID, some of them either didn't have internet or they didn't have a laptop. You're talking about all the venture capital and money that's flowing. That ought to be something that's easy.
$5 billion, which is a drop in the bucket compared to, we spend $120 billion every year on venture capital. And here's the thing, it's not just to make sure kids can do their homework. Of course, that's a challenge. You don't want to have to compete with your brother or sister to be able to do your homework, but it's more than that. It's about the aspiration. If someone grows up without a laptop, and I talked to someone, was at a well-known HBCU, and she said a lot of her classmates didn't have laptops. Are we really signaling to them that they're going to be part of the modern economy? All this stuff about people in Silicon Valley being self-made. Yeah, it's true. They're not Donald Trump. They didn't have millions and millions of dollars, but I'll tell you what they had. They usually went to a good private school. They certainly had access to computers at a young age. They certainly had healthcare. They had nutrition. They lived in pretty safe neighborhoods, and they had the luxury to dream, meaning if they failed, they knew they had a safety net with at least upper middle class parents. Giving a laptop is the basic to telling someone they've got a shot in this new economy.
Congressman, how much of what you prescribe in the book, how much of that overlaps with Build Back Better? Wouldn't that bill address some of this?
Build Back Better is the beginning, the start. Right. I mean, let me say this, the preschool education, making sure every kid gets a preschool education. You know how far back we are? You know, France started doing this in 1890. The IKL system there, basically everyone at the age of 6 is in preschool, has had preschool. And whether you're the son of a billionaire or the son of a working class, you start out at a relatively equal level there because you've had quality preschool. Imagine if we did that here. And this is so important in my view to understand. It's not just about teaching tech and coding. You know, you want to understand what people had who have succeeded in Silicon Valley. It's they had a great education before preschool and up through at least high school. And that ought to be the building blocks for a modern economy. And then you look at Build Back Better and what it would do in terms of the investment in climate. And these are the new jobs. These are so much of the new technology jobs are going to be in solar and wind and battery and building things for technology. That's absolutely essential. And then on healthcare, name me one Silicon Valley entrepreneur who says they're self-made and ask them, you know, did you have a challenge getting treated by a doctor? Were your parents not able to afford your medicine? Ask them that. You know, they're self-made. Yeah, they're self-made compared to people who've inherited millions of dollars. Yeah, they started a business, but we take for granted, like the air we breathe, many of folks out there, that we have good health, that we have good education. I don't understand why that's so hard to do for every American in a digital age where we know that the investment in human people is the biggest investment any country can make. It's not just about morality and human dignity. It's about actually being smart and making that investment. And that's ultimately, in my view, the president's vision, why he's so passionate about Build Back Better.
Where are we on that? Do you see any hope for that getting through? Is it going to have to be broken up into different pieces? What do you think?
The hope is that we can make sure that the biggest elements, the free public education, the free preschool, the climate parts, the expansion of Medicare get through, and then we vote on everything else separately. I think we can get there. Senator Manchin has said that he is for the climate provisions. He has said that he is for the preschool. Every kid, 3 and 4-year-old kid should get preschool. He said he's for some of the childcare provisions. So I think we can get there on a compromise. It's not going to be what I wanted. It's not going to be what the House progressives wanted, but it's going to be historic and it moves the ball forward. And then let's vote on everything else and run onto that in the election.
One other thing, and you mentioned the whole speech issue, and you know, freedom of speech also requires people feeling comfortable in that space. One of the things we now know is that many of these algorithms, for example, on social media, actually promote conflict. For example, you and I have this conversation. You know, we'll post it on social media, but it would go viral if you and I had an argument. If we started fighting right here in this conversation, it would just go completely viral. You know, what do we do about that? Because I mean, I think that too is a part of the problem, and it lends itself to some of the divisions and confusions and insurrectionist thinking, if you will, that the more conflict that you put out there, the more interest and the more promotion that it gets.
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the reality is conflict sells, the anger sells, and what these algorithms do is they take the worst of human impulse and they put it in the feeds of those who are most vulnerable. They say, okay, you're going to listening to this outrage and these conspiracy theories. And the problem with social media is that they have this view that just let people talk and any speech is fine. But you and I know that that's not the right way of a democracy, that there are thoughtful ways of having speech and not thoughtful ways of having speech. You've spent your whole career thinking about thoughtful ways of engaging people. And instead of uplifting that, instead of having any sense of what may be good for democracy, they're looking simply at profits, at engagement. You would have a very different show if all you cared about were ratings. You wouldn't have me on. Let's just be candid. I mean, there are 100 other people you could get on, which would probably be more interesting for views, but you have a view that you have some responsibility to public discourse. And social media lacks that, and that's a big problem. It needs a regulation as a solution, but it also needs an entirely different culture and ethics.
Indeed, indeed. Congressman Ro Khanna's book is out, folks. Do check it out. This is the next frontier that we've got to explore and make work for all of us. That's the title of the book, Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. This is a timely discussion, one that needs to be had, and who better to have it than one who represents Silicon Valley? Well, he's their congressman. I don't know how much they let him represent them. I'm sure they have issues because he's holding them accountable, and he ought to. We're appreciative of that. Dignity in a Digital Age, wherever you get your books, wherever books are sold, by Congressman Ro Khanna. Thank you, my friend. Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.